Brett Amron here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Bast. We are Bast Amron, and this is the Practice Podcast. Today, we are going to talk about the duties of officers and directors in the current climate. So, Brett, we have been getting a lot of calls from small, mid-size, and large business owners who are making decisions about their business. They have no revenue. They're not sure which creditors to pay, whether they should continue to borrow money, should they shut their business down, and they're really struggling with their decision-making process. And so I guess the question to you is, are there any guideposts by which directors or officers of companies should be making their decisions?
Yeah, so state law will govern articles of organization, of incorporation, will also govern, depending upon the state, that your business either operates in or is incorporated in. But generally speaking, there are three duties that officers, directors are required to adhere to. Number one is a duty of care, meaning acting in a reasonable manner in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. Two would be duty of loyalty, not putting yourself as an officer and director and your own interests ahead of those of the company and the shareholders. And the third is what's known as a duty of oversight under a very famous decision called Caremark, that basically means that you have to ensure that those below you, those that you oversee, are fulfilling their obligations as well. Of course, we know that what's called in the zone of insolvency, when a company gets into the zone of insolvency, there's an obligation to the creditors. And what is insolvency, right? That means, that if you are, your company is balance sheet, meaning your liabilities are greater than your assets, or you're just not able to pay your bills as you operate. And those are very rudimentary definitions. But those are generally what officers, directors need to do. What I always sort of look for is, do the right thing. And that, and you sit down and figure out, well, what's the right thing here?
Right.
Officers, directors obviously have the defense of business judgment, meaning that they're not if they educate themselves, if they get advice from either attorneys, consultants, accountants, and heed that advice based upon a host of information that they educate themselves with, they can be insulated from potentially any liability, and they could be found to have adhered to their fiduciary obligations.
What do you mean? Why when you said they can be insulated, they have defenses. What do you mean about liability? Why would they have liability?
Well, again, if they're not fulfilling their obligation to shareholders, for example, right? And if there is a securities claim, if you're a publicly traded company and there's a securities claim brought by the shareholders of the company against the officers, directors for, let's say there's been a huge decline in value of the shares or of the business itself and the value of the business. You also have an obligation, even if it's privately held, if it's an LLC, to members of the LLC, if it's a corporation, to the shareholders of the corporation as well. And they could sue. And you also get into the situation in a bankruptcy or an insolvency when a court-appointed fiduciary, meaning a bankruptcy trustee, a receiver, or an assignee in an assignment for the benefit of creditors, may have the opportunity to pursue a claim against the officers, directors for breach of fiduciary duty based upon damages, breaching their duty to the company and to the creditors if in fact there's an insolvency situation.
So to be clear, and you mentioned that in the time of insolvency, those duties that you mentioned is often a duty to shareholders or owners. Those duties will shift, right? Or the priorities shift, and now the shareholders don't have priority, and now the creditors have priority. So I think, because a lot of the conversations that we've been having are mid to small size businesses that aren't publicly held. At least I shouldn't say small, but they're closely held companies. And so And a lot of directors, outside directors, have been surprised when we tell them about this potential liability, that they could have liability. But that's liability to creditors. So this topic is particularly pertinent in this climate where creditors are numbering and the amounts that they're owed are growing.
Well, to be clear, there's not a new fiduciary duty to creditors, but
Right.
it is a duty to the company. And if you take actions which otherwise unnecessarily increase the debt load to the company or creditor claims against the company, then you may be held liable, or there may be some liability for those damages for the creditor claims and the unpaid creditors.
So
And so it's not a necessarily, and there's been case law on this, that a fiduciary duty to creditors, meaning a creditor would necessarily have the right in some situations to sue directors and officers, but you could be responsible for the damages to the company for the creditors that have been unpaid.
But this is a way that an outside director, so if you're an outside director of a closely held business, you haven't guaranteed any of the debts, so you ordinarily wouldn't be concerned about running up a bunch of liabilities.
Right.
And so this might be a reason that really should shift their thinking. And a lot of directors just aren't even aware. We've had these conversations in the last few months, and many of them just really aren't even aware of these duties, much less how to discharge the duty.
Right.
And you touched on this before, but one of the main ways to discharge those duties, obviously, is being loyal to the company, not putting your own personal interest ahead of the company, duty of loyalty. But in terms of duty of care, it's really making informed decisions. And I always emphasize that informed part.
Yep.
And that's what we're saying about hiring advisors, accountants.
Yeah. So informed decisions are, asking questions at board meetings, asking questions of your officers, your CEO, CFO, COO, getting advice from outside third parties. And I know that's not always financially practical depending upon the company, and I understand that. But you can, as a board member or as an officer who may not be involved in day-to-day or in every aspect of a business, ask the questions, get the information, and educate yourself. And that is where most officers and directors fall flat, and they just listen to what they're told, and they make decisions even when they sort of think there may be an issue. Get the advice and educate yourself as well, and get insurance, right? Ensure that there's director and officer liability insurance. Again, I understand that it's not always feasible from a financial perspective, depending upon the size of the company and the revenues. But if they have a board and they have officers, in all likelihood, there should be enough that you can get yourself director and officer liability insurance that would help cover, any claim, help pay defense costs if there is a claim, as well as any liability.
But it's kind of like trying to get homeowners insurance during hurricane season. You can't try and go get D&O insurance, director and officer liability insurance, at a time when the company is cratering. So really, the advice I give to board members is, when you get asked to serve on the board of a company, that's the time to make sure they have insurance.
That's one of the first questions. I mean, I get calls periodically from people, saying, listen, I'm, thinking about, I've been asked to be on this board, and I always say, well, the first question I ask is, do they have insurance? I don't know. Right. Well, you should ask that question and get the policy and review it, or have somebody who knows, the ins and outs of D&O insurance to review it, to make sure that there's sufficient coverage and that there's proper coverage, and make sure of that. And so, yeah, I would absolutely ask those questions. For especially in the current environment, and with what we've got going on, right, with the whole, with coronavirus and the pandemic, and now, we've got issues with employees and employee safety, and the whole movement that we've got as well with inclusion and equality, and the proper treatment of employees, and getting into a whole social component. There's been there was some conversations about whether or not officers and directors of first you start with the large publicly traded companies, and maybe it, works its way down, and whether or not they should have a social responsibility.
Right. I was going to ask you, should there be some component of that? Because most business decisions, at least at the board level, are driven by pure profit.
Right.
Purely
Right.
economics. But do you think that is there a time when something other than economics and profit should be driving decisions? So, for example, you just mentioned the employees, particularly in this climate.
Right.
Most businesses, ours, for example, we made the decision very early on to go remote. And it was easy for us to do that, and that didn't really impact our profits as much as it might impact some businesses, like a manufacturing business. But some businesses, manufacturers, just to use that as an example, must have had to make a decision to sacrifice profit for safety.
Right.
And so how does those social considerations factor in, or should they factor in? I'm
Yeah,
not sure we know yet, but
right. I don't think we know yet. And obviously with the current environment and hopefully the movement towards more inclusion and equality, hopefully there will be some conversation around that, because some would argue that the more the better you treat your employees, and perhaps the better your role in a community, the stronger your company is, and the more valuable your company is. Yeah. And I think, listen, there's companies that do this for sure. But there's companies that, and they get lambasted, some companies, because, in some boards, because, well, you made a decision to do X, which cost the company more money and ate into the profits to the detriment of shareholders. But at the end of the day, yes, in the short term, maybe that happened, but in the long term, that may be better, right? For the company and the brand and the value. And so I would hope that perhaps there is this shift at some point, and maybe now's the time, that boards and officers can start thinking more broadly about these issues, and not fear that there could be some negative impact from shareholders, because they want to be better stewards of the community. They want to treat their employees better, whether it be wages, whether it be work environment, think all that stuff.
I think we will see that at least to some degree, because there will be, maybe a few months from now, there will be shareholder lawsuits and receiver trustee lawsuits against directors and officers of companies who ultimately fail as a result of this pandemic. And one of their defenses will be, we really didn't have a choice. We had to shut down. And essentially what they'd be saying is, we put the safety of our employees ahead of the profits, even though they're not going to say it that way, but that really is what happened. That's the decision making. And so maybe that will be the impetus for a shift where safety, social issues become as important. We already know it's become on equal footing with the emergence of B Corps and other socially conscious decision making in business. But it'll be interesting to see if this is a more long-term shift.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Would love to see that. But it's gonna take some time before you get that first case, with and a decision on whether or not the failure to do any of that, whether treating employees or the community or whatever, is a breach of any sort of duty and results in liability. But maybe it's a change in the laws, and maybe who knows. But
I mean, I think there's a good argument that putting the safety of your employees is a profit-driven decision, because it may sacrifice short-term profits, but taking care of your people,
long term,
in the long term, is certainly going to be much more proven.
But look how hard it is. Look how hard it is to move, away from minimum wage, or just above minimum wage, and how hard it is for different legislatures in different states to change the minimum wage and increase it. And when why, right?
I think that's a different podcast.
No, it is, but I think that one of the considerations is, well, we're eating into our profits.
Right.
And
short term.
short term, right?
Right.
It's
It's
short term
long term
profits,
decision making
right?
versus short term.
Right.
Because if
And
you're
I
short term,
understand. Look, and I understand small business. It's a very different equation. That when you pay minimum wage, there's different businesses, especially small businesses that operate on very thin margins. And I understand that, and I'm not taking anything away from that. To me, the broader scope is when you've got these large corporations, a lot of multinational, you've got publicly traded, you've got larger corporations that are closely held, that perhaps they could, in fact, and again, it's not just a wage issue. It is an overall employee
right.
issue, maybe a community issue too. But these are things that are going to have to play out, and there's going to have to be a shift. And it's going to have to start, I think it's going to have to start with influential boards, influential officers, directors that are going to have to make those decisions and come out for that.
Right.
And say, we're going to do this. We're going to be socially conscious, and not just say we're socially conscious and we're going to actually do this. Here's what we're going to do.
Well, I think you'll see long term, those are the businesses that will survive. That common refrain was always customer first.
Right.
But then there was more recently a suggestion that that's really the wrong way to approach it. If you put employee first,
right,
the employees will take care of the customers.
Yeah, agreed. And that's where the strength and the value of the company comes in, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the way we've done it, and it's worked so far.
So far. So a topic that will continue to evolve, and
great topic.
Yeah, we'll continue to talk about it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.